Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Think Tent for this panel about how we can break Britain's spending addiction, which is really, realistically, in my opinion, the key issue for any party, both either in government or seeking to be the next government. Now, it's not going to be a secret to anyone in this room here that Britain's public finances are in deep, deep trouble. Debt is soaring, waste is widespread, and yet again it's going to be taxpayers left footing the bill, with the tax burden set to reach a record post-war high as of April next year. Now, despite years of promises to balance the books, the state keeps growing, and with it, so does the pressure on household budgets. Whether it's billions lost to fraud, bloated bureaucracy, or unchecked welfare spending, the sense that the system is out of control is only growing. And the political reality is that if the Conservatives want to be trusted with the nation's finances once again, then they have to show that they mean business, which means making real choices to cut spending. And obviously we heard yesterday from Mel Stride about a £47 billion package to do that, but there needs to be more as the next few years unveil themselves. So how do we stop this spiral? How do we rein in spending, which is breaking public services? And is there realistically the political will to do it? Now, to answer all of these questions, and I hope many more as well from you in the audience, we've got a star-studded panel here for you today. To my right, we have Lord David Frost, who's obviously the member of the House of Lords. We have Andrew Griffith, who's the Shadow Secretary of State for Business and Trade, and also the Member of Parliament for Arundel and South Downs. Then to my left, we have Richard Fuller, who's the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and also Member of Parliament for North Bedfordshire. And to my far left, we have Shimian Lee, who's one of our policy analysts here at the Taxpayers Alliance. So the house rules for this event is I'm going to ask each of our panelists to make a few opening remarks before we then turn it over to you in the audience for a Q&A with them. So David, without much further ado, do you want to get us going?
Okay, thanks very much, Darwin. Thank you for having me. Just three or four remarks to kind of kick us off. I'm sure we all know what the situation is, so I won't dwell on the numbers other than to note the basic fact that spending is something like 8 or 9% of GDP higher than it was in the first years of Tony Blair's government. Taxation is sort of 6 to 7% of GDP higher, and we have presided over a good chunk of that as a Conservative Party, if not all of it. We're at the highest level of spending and taxation since the war. Taxation actually the highest level ever in the existence of the British state. So the situation is unprecedented and unprecedentedly bad, and we have to do something about it. I think we need some numbers, and we need to make the right arguments. To cut things sort of short, I'm sure we can go into the detail. My view is that the party needs to set out a 10-year plan for getting spending back down to those early Blair era levels. That is getting on for 1% of GDP every year off spending. And that means in our first term, if we get that far, we have to take out something like 125, 130 billion off the total in real terms to stay on that target. That is not that different to the size of the deficit, of course. Ideally, one would want some of these savings to be going into tax reductions, but and I still think that ought to be possible, but nevertheless, that is the nature of the problem. The deficit is huge. In parallel for this, we've got to do two things. First of all, we've got to do some market reform as well, and deregulate and get the economy going in other ways, and that is going to be a massive task as well, but it's not the subject for today, so I won't dwell on it, other than to say it's essential, because if you are cutting spending, you need to be doing other things to stimulate the economy in parallel. We need to be making a moral case as well as a financial case for a smaller state. I don't know that the financial case is that well understood, certainly. The moral case is hardly understood at all, and we've all forgotten what it was like to live in a society where you were able to determine where the largest proportion of your money went. Your assets were your own. You didn't have to pay attention to the public policy objectives of the government or its rhetoric if you wanted to use your own property and assets as you saw fit. And Lady Thatcher was very good at making this moral case for a smaller state, and we need to find the right language for today, but we mustn't neglect the fact that a small state is important in a free country. We also need to start that now, and I think we need to be clear, as I said, about the scale of the task. I don't think the 47 billion that was announced yesterday, is anything more than a small down payment. To be honest, we have talked it up, but it's nothing like, I'm afraid, the scale of the changes that are going to be needed to get us back on track. So, we really need to speak in those terms. We need to make clear that this is a major task going over not one but two terms. I would also say we mustn't concede ground to the opposition, however tactical it is, and I know those in the Shadow Cabinet won't be able to say this, but I was a bit disappointed to hear our Shadow Chancellor just now saying that if he was in Rachel Reeves' position, he would raise income tax. I thought our view was that we should be cutting spending rather than increasing any kind of tax, and expect to hear that quoted back at us. So it is really important to have consistency of messaging. So I'll stop there. To conclude, we've got to be serious about the level of the task. We've got to set it as a long-running task. It isn't something you can just do in year one or year two and then move on from. This is a sustained national effort over a long period. We need to make the moral case as well as the financial case. We need to be consistent about what we are saying, and we need to be honest with the British people that we can't go on as we are now. The easy thing would be to say we can, but we can't. Therefore, we've got to start making that case now, so that when we reach election time, hopefully it's starting to be understood and we have something to work with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Andrew.
I'm so pleased. The title is How, Not Whether We Should Break the State Spending Addiction. We all know that it's not sustainable for the state to be spending more than 45 pence in every pound, and for that amount to continue to increase. It doesn't offer us the prosperity that we need. So focusing on that how in particular, Warren Buffett's right-hand man, Charlie Munger, said, "Show me the incentives and I will show you the outcome." And as somebody who's spent a lot of time thinking about incentives, structuring organisations in business, we need a fundamentally different way of thinking about the incentives, particularly of the public sector, that is the consumer of all of that taxpayers' money. The first thing I would do is pay every single public servant on the basis of GDP per capita. There's no particular logical science as to why that measure rather than others, but it would drive some much valued, needed goal alignment, which is all too lacking otherwise in the public sector. It would also remind them every day, if they looked at their payslip, that their action should be to focus on growing the economy and making it more productive. We do need far fewer public servants. When I was a finance director struggling to control my marketing budget, the simple reality was the more people I had in the marketing team who would spend all of their time devising new and exciting campaigns and way of spending money, the way to actually rein that in is simply to have fewer people at the centre. And so that's something, I don't think you cut Whitehall to deliver significant savings. well, you cut Whitehall to deliver a significant reduction in activity, which then delivers those savings. And the same would absolutely be true of the arm's length regulators. I was regulated in business, like every regulator ever known ever. It was set up as a light touch strategic regulator. Don't you worry your pretty little head. It'll just be a few of us thinking grand thoughts. Well, that particular regulator, set up with 40 people, is now well through 1,000 well-paid salariat every year, and it's in the market for recruiting about another 400 as we speak. So we do have to have a relatively blunt instrument of a significant pruning, a significant haircut to the number of people who are spending this money. David is absolutely right. We should couch this as we should most things through a moral case. Hayek talked about you can only have personal freedom if you have economic freedom. We see all of the time the state using its spending of public money as a reason to encroach on our personal freedoms, whether it's we need ID cards to protect for the first time the welfare budget, we need to tell you exactly what you can and can't eat, what foods can and can't be advertised to you as consenting adults, in the name of continuing to put the fire and burn the furniture into the NHS. So it's important we couch those two things in harmony. We will have to look at a significant, just as this government is busy nationalising businesses, and of course that moves things from the private sector ledger, part of the ledger, into the public sector, we will have to look, wherever we end up with the nationalisation programme of the government, at reprivatisation. Of course that works well because it moves things from being less productive back into being more productive. Welfare reform, again, is a real clear moral purpose. It is an abrogation of our moral leadership to leave people languishing on sofas with only Netflix for company when so many more of them could be contributing to the public, to the productive side of the economy. And finally, just to be controversial, you need a new generation of politicians. You need people who don't want to go into politics because they want a red box or an easy life, who aren't aggrandizing, who actually are willing to take the hard decisions that will save our country, guarantee our future, make our children more prosperous. That may need different people for a different generation. But when we get into power, and we have those plans, and David and I both know this and saw this up close and personal, conservative governments trying to do conservative things were thwarted by conservative colleagues telling us they would not support us in the voting lobby. That was a great undoing of ours, and we need to be more steely. We need to have those plans in advance, surface those plans in advance, and like Newt Gingrich with the contract with America, make sure everybody is signed up in blood to execute those plans when we get into office.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Richard.
Phil, thank you very much, Darwin. Ladies and gentlemen, across European countries, citizens like you are witnessing the death rattle of the social democratic conceit about how public services can be provided. The conceit of a system in large part is based upon the spend now, pay for it later system of provision. The conceit that the state should always and everywhere be there to help out when you fall on temporarily difficult times or when you take a ill-advised risk. The conceit that somehow my generation can have it all without any problem whatsoever for all of the young people in this room. That model, ladies and gentlemen, is on its last legs, and we have to be honest about that. You can continue if you wish, and I'd like to see in the room. We built this model. They built this model based on the fact that you could absolutely guarantee every year 2% or 3% annual economic growth. Hands up here who can guarantee 2-3% growth? Nobody. Right? And you can guarantee that if you can be sure that you will have a growing working age population to look after us when we get old. Hands up everyone here who thinks that we're going to have an increasing working age population to look after us. Right. So you have just destroyed, ladies and gentlemen, the two pillars of the conceit of the Social Democrats about how you can provide public service provision. So we have to find a new model. And the answer to the question about how do we spake the spending addiction has two pillars. First of all, public awareness. Are the public aware of this? Sadly, no. It is always nicer to have the comfort of how things are rather than to challenge yourself about how things need to be. You need events such as the 1970s with all of the problems with strikes and the burdening of going to the IMF for there to be a breakthrough. And for those who remember, the 1979 election was not an easy election to fight. In fact, it was almost lost in 1978. But what you also need, and this is easier for us, is to have politicians with the courage to paint that new vision in a way that people feel comfortable, that they can make the transition comfortably and easily, and that they have a goal in their hearts and their heads which they think is right. And for people my age, the thing that I think resonates with people, certainly resonates with me, is the idea that we want to build a future where those public services are secure for our children and grandchildren. Because that, ladies and gentlemen, is after all what politics should all be about the long term, about building a better future for our children and grandchildren. In my non-policy role, because I leave policy to Andrew and the Shadow Cabinet, I just do numbers, and Andrew doesn't need any help with those, but we can have a good Barney about it. But I have 6 streams of work on this reshaping behind what Kemi was saying about the rewiring the state. Number 1, liabilities management. We often talk about our debt. That's £2.5 trillion. That's a lot of money. But if you're in politics, of course, you understand that your liabilities aren't just the liabilities you pass down to the bond markets to pay for. They're the liabilities that you pass on to future taxpayers to pay for. So on top of that £2.5 trillion in debt, we have £1 trillion in other liabilities, such as nuclear decommissioning costs, medical negligence, for which no money has been set aside. We have £1.5 trillion in public sector worker pensions. And if you're in the private sector, some of you may run businesses, you know if you don't put money aside for those pensions, you go to jail. No money has been set aside for public sector pensions. That's £1.5 trillion. And then we have the state pension, £4 trillion of liabilities for the pensions for young people and people working. So, ladies and gentlemen, we don't have a 2.5 trillion problem. We have a 9 trillion pound problem. So, one of the areas I want to look at is how can we look at those liabilities in a better way. Second of all, and Andrew made this point very strongly, not only in the government itself, but in these arm's length bodies, we've got to look at the skills, the incentives, and the accountabilities of those who work in the public sector. I don't know about you, but and I'm sure many of us may have a problem getting an appointment with a GP sometime in the last 2 years, right? Who knows who runs GP appointments in the NHS or in your local area? Has anyone heard of anyone being fired or held to account for it? No. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So we need to do something about that. Number 3, personnel effectiveness. And so that partly is making sure we have the right sizing of civil service. Partly is about making sure you have people doing things that are there to deliver a product for the people, not fancy about on things that aren't crucial for public services. The 4th, process improvement. And tied to that, quite importantly, is the impact of new technologies that can help bureaucratic processes in particular, but also can help us restructure the state. One of the problems with the state is that it is bureaucrat-driven. We require operators to be told to us by the people at the top. No. We should be working out with far more control over the public services, and technology, I believe, gives us an opportunity, just as it is with managing your finances or even now with your health records, to do something on that. And finally, why government? We have to go back to challenging the fact that ultimately in life, it is a good thing when you can to be self-reliant. What we learnt growing up was essentially in life, you should do the best that you can for yourself and your family, and then you have a responsibility to look after those around you and make sure they have a leg up so they can look after their families too. There was never government in that story. So our responsibility, the moral case, as people of both David and Andrew mentioned, the moral case for personal responsibility is a message that Conservatives need to amplify in the years ahead.
Thank you very much, Richard. And finally, Shimim.
Thank you, Darwin. Right, so I'm afraid a bit of a hard truth coming from me. So we've talked a lot about fiscal responsibility. We've talked a lot about balancing the budget. But what does that actually mean? You know, how much money are we talking about? I think that's an issue that I'd like to focus on. So if we look at 2025-26, the current financial year, total government receipts was about £1.23 trillion. That's every single penny the government takes in taxes, revenues, fees. Now, at the same time, in that financial year, in this financial year, the government will spend 1.35 trillion. So that's a gap of 118 billion pounds. So in order to balance the budget, we're talking about spending 118 billion pounds less. And keep in mind, that's not to cut taxes or to reduce the debt. That's just to balance the budget. That's just to eliminate the deficit. Now, how much is that in percentage terms compared to the current budget? So excluding things like debt interest, which obviously we can't cut back on, we have to pay our debts, that's about 111 billion pounds. So that's taking that out, excluding that, cutting 118 billion pounds is about 9.5% cut on current expenditure. Now, if we exclude defense, that's another area I think most people will agree that we have to spend on. That's another 70 billion pounds. That brings up the amount that we have to cut to about 10.1%. Now, excluding the state pension, which I'm not sure how much political appetite there is for cutting even within the Conservative Party, that's another 145 billion pounds. That brings the amount we have to cut up to 11.6%. Now, excluding health spending, another area where I think politically might be difficult to talk about cuts, that's 145 billion pounds. That brings it up to, that's 232 billion pounds. That brings it up to 15% cut. Now, that's the amount that we have to cut in order to balance the budget, essentially. But let's talk about that remaining spending for a moment. We've excluded some parts of it. Now we talk about what comprises the remaining spending, right? So there are two different types of spending. There's capital spending. That's spending on things like IT systems, buildings, maintenance, infrastructure. That's about 18% of spending in general. And the rest of it is day-to-day spending. So that's wages for civil servants, benefits to people. So one key point is that in order to raise productivity, which is very important in terms of reducing the amount that we spend, capital spending is absolutely essential to that. So if we say we exclude the capital spending from what we want to cut, that means that brings the amount that we actually have to cut up to 18.3%. That's a massive amount. That's nearly one out of every £5. Now compare that to what was previously achieved under the coalition government, where they managed 3% real terms cut over the course of 3 years, compared to the 18.3% cut that you have to make to balance the budget. That is the scale of the problem, and it's a very serious problem. So that will involve making hard choices. I think it's unrealistic to expect that we can make such a massive cut just from improving productivity or reducing, the civil service headcount. I think it's all about reducing the scope of government as well, because if we don't reduce the scope of government, then we can't reduce the headcount, as the previous Conservative government found. For many years, there was a commitment to reduce the size of the civil service, but year after year, the civil service continued to grow because we did not trim the scope of government. So it's more than just talking about headline figures. Let's say we want to reduce the size of the civil service, we have to talk about what exactly are we reducing. So for example, policy staff within the civil service has grown massively over the last few years. If we want to reduce the size of the civil service, we will be reducing policy staff. And that means what policies do we want to cut, which policies exactly are we willing to cut in order to achieve that reduction. So we cannot just look at the headline figures and say we'll cut X amount of staff without looking at the work that they're doing and how we're going to reduce the scope of government. I think another important point is that we need to talk about the commitments that government have made over the past many years. I mean, things like the triple lock state pensions, but also on welfare, which is another major area of spending. I think for far too often, governments in the past have made commitments that sound very good on paper, but don't really shape out to fiscal reality. We saw that very recently in Labour's attempt to reform the welfare system. So to avoid the perception that they were taking away benefits from people, I think one of the commitments they made was that no one who was already on benefits, existing claimants, would lose out. Well, that sounds very good on paper, but in reality, what that means is that we're creating essentially a two-tier benefit system where people will get different amounts of benefits depending on when they sign up for benefits. That's a lot harder to administer. That reduces the amount that we can save. And it also gives a very perverse incentive for people to stay on as long as possible because they know that once they leave, it's going to be very, very difficult to get back. So I think we have to be really, really honest about the fact that cuts will mean that people will get less. I think there's a big difference between what we want to happen, what we sort of aspire to, the kind of society we want to create, and what we can actually afford. Just to give a few examples, housing benefit, for example. I entirely understand that people want to stay where they grew up in, where they have support networks in, but at the end of the day, it's simply unaffordable to pay housing benefit based on central London prices, even though there are very good reasons why people want to stay. It's simply unaffordable, and I think that's a message that we have to get across. Similarly, with disability benefits, the previous government had a very common sense proposal to move to a New Zealand style disability benefit system, where instead of giving people, cash payments straight up without any conditions at all, in New Zealand, what they have is you have to submit a receipt for the precise cost of disability to the government, and you get reimbursed. I think that's a very, very common sense proposal. But of course, it was met with massive opposition from disability groups on the basis that it would undermine the disabled people's independence and autonomy. Now, no one wants to reduce anyone's autonomy, but when the cost is tens of billions of pounds in spending, I think we have to have a conversation, a very grown-up conversation, about what we can actually afford. Now, I think for many groups that government will encounter in terms of trying to cut spending, the only acceptable thing for them is more spending. And I think it's the job of the government to stand up for taxpayers and say, no, that's enough. The message that we should be trying to communicate is not that we found some brilliant solution in which we'll be able to save money and no one else will be worse off. We have to be very honest and say that we simply cannot afford to provide the same level of benefits as before. And that's about the political challenge, right? But there's also different challenges depending on the sort of area of spending you're looking at. So in some ways, that political challenge is a lot easier than the other challenge, which is time, right? When it comes to some benefits, or some areas of spending, the key challenge is not the political difficulty, well, I suppose it is the political difficulty, but the main difficulty is time. So if you look at public sector pensions, for example, major costs to taxpayers, the key problem is that even if we could snap our fingers right now and transition to a defined contribution system, in which employees pay in and they get out what they pay in compared to a defined benefit system, which we have now, where the state guarantees a certain payout, even if we could snap our fingers right now and switch everyone over, we would still need to pay for the cost of current beneficiaries of these pension schemes. So what we would see in the short to medium term is a lot less money coming in because it's all going to the defined contribution pensions, and our expenses in terms of paying for current pensioners, that will still have to pay it in the meantime. So that will actually cause a rise in spending in the short term. And that's a problem of time, because we will only achieve savings in the very long term when the people on defined contribution pensions finally retire. So that's another difficulty. So that's not so much a political difficulty as it is just one of time. Same for the state pension, I think. A fairer system would be an individual saving system, like they have in countries like Singapore, where you save for your own retirement and you get out what you put into the system, essentially. But once again, even if we could swap to that system right now, that would take time to see the effects, the savings turn out. So it's not all doom and gloom. I don't want to end on a gloomy note. I want to end on a little bit more of a hopeful note. So much has been said about what's gone wrong with the Conservative Party in the past, about the last 14 years, 14 years, 14 years, 14 years, you hear it all the time. And I think there's not enough said about what went right under the last 14 years of Conservative government, and I think that there are parts of the record, on spending at least, that are worth defending. So throughout the 2010s, I think there were actual real terms cuts in public spending that were achieved under the coalition government. That's the last time we've seen anything close to real terms cuts, if you can imagine that, that put public finances on a lot firmer footing. As a percentage of GDP, spending went down from about 45% of GDP to 40% of GDP. Now today it's back up to 45%. And in that time period, we saw things like public sector pay freezes, we saw things like benefits freeze, we saw the civil service headcount actually come down, and much higher productivity growth than under the previous Labour government. In fact, under the previous Labour government, productivity went down every year on average, whereas under the coalition government at least, it went up. So I think that mistakes were certainly made under the last administration. And some of the savings may not be repeatable. We have to find new ways to save money. But, the last 14 years, the fact that the Conservative government lasted 14 years means voters saw something in that government and agreed with it and re-elected it. So I think there's not a need to apologize every time 14 years is brought up. I think maybe apologize just for the last 4.
Tell us what you really think, Jimmy, now. Now, I'm not going to abuse the position of chair of this panel, because I'm sure there's plenty of questions you've got out there in the audience. Now, some house rules. We've got a couple of roving mics, so just wait until the mic reaches you. And then if you could just say your name, and if your question's for a particular panelist, just tell us who it is. So we've got the gentleman right here at the front, wherever our roving... Anne, just here right at the front.
Thank you, Darwin. Andrew Brannan from Richmond Park. It's a question really to probably the two MPs on the panel. A plea, really. Can we have some more honesty in the language? I remember back in the coalition days, Osborne used to talk about paying down the deficit. No, not nonsense, utter nonsense. And when we hear about long-term debt reduction, actually what the politician omits is brackets as a percentage of GDP, close brackets. Now, that's quite a mouthful for the public to understand, but they get the impression that by doing certain things, debt is going to fall. And as you've both explained, debt is not falling, and it's never going to fall. So honesty in the language, then people might accept the sort of measures that your numbers, Shimian, are clearly showing need to be taken.
Andrew, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, look, I'll try and always be honest. As Richard laid out, the off-balance sheet liabilities, but even on an on-balance sheet basis, the state hasn't balanced its books for 25 years. In the whole of my lifetime, there have only been 5 years in which they've actually balanced the current account. And 3 of those times were reportedly accidental overshoots. I'm honest, I always say that in my speeches, always. I always talk about 45p in the pound that the government spends, and almost invariably people are horrified to hear that. We keep doing that. We will bring, I think, the public debate towards us in terms of fiscal responsibility. And Richard's always the same in doing that.
Richard.
Yeah, okay, no, I might not say that. I'm not going to say anything off-piece anymore. On honesty...
Come on. Come on,
No, that's a monologue. Politics is a dialogue that in effective societies ends in a resolution between people talking about things, then you govern. And so the counterpart to Andrew, what you said about honesty from politicians is honesty by the public as well. And that's why I said you need the public to understand the situation we're in. And you can't confront an election people with a problem and say, oh, here's a whole bunch of terrible things and blah, blah, blah. What you have to say is, here's why we need to take the actions that we want to take and why it leads to a better future. And we know already, because we know Rachel Reeves has lost control of the economy, she's out of her depth, we know that businesses are hurting, and we also know from, as Andrew said, from our time in government, we left a lot in terms of regulatory reform undone, that we can talk to business people about what the business agenda of the country will be, and business will want to resonate with that. We have, though, I think, a lot of work still to do with the British public about why it is important that people in our generation, my generation, focus with a laser beam on the life chances of people who are at school right now and starting out in their jobs right now. And that's why the 3 events at that stage of life, when you get your first job, when you buy your first home, and when you start a family, those are 3 of the foundational pillars of a well-run society. Those work well, and people can engage like that. We do very well. So I think there has to be some honesty on that. And the final point is, talking about these off-balance sheet liabilities, politicians haven't talked about those for ages. That's the point I was trying to make about the conceit of the social democratic consensus. They were off limits. You couldn't talk about it. In fact, they didn't even enter the dialogue. I mean, many people, when I tell people that we have a £9 trillion problem, they think, do we? I didn't know that. But that's what we're passing down to future generations. And Shimion's point about timing, just final point. Yeah. There is an interplay between how you manage your off-balance sheet liabilities, the things I talked about, the public sector pension liabilities, and the amount of money you pay on your debt. Because bond markets will look at long-term policies that reduce the future need for borrowing in a positive way and will reward governments in the short term through lower long-term borrowing costs. Won't be huge, but there is an offset.
Let's take a question from this side of the room. Yes, we've got the gentleman here, Callum, in the 3rd row.
Just a very quick one. From what everybody's been saying, the first thing that's going to walk into you is the press saying, oh, return of austerity. How are you going to, particularly the MPs, fight the term austerity, which the media will hit you with?
David, do you want to start on that one, though?
I think it is a real problem. I might be wrong about this, but I think it's in Nigel Lawson's memoirs. He says somewhere that you have to remember, if you're taking £1 billion out of public spending, that is less than 1/10 of 1% of our public spending. That's taking £1,000 off 1 million people every year. So it's very easy to see how you very rapidly kind of generate opposition with this. And I think it is important not to speak kind of casually about it. That's why I think it's important to set out a long-run programme. It's important to work out what's sustainable, what we actually can do. set it out and then stick to it and not be pushed around by this. Don't over kind of promise, but also don't under promise and make clear it's a long run issue. I think we probably need to think of another word than austerity, to be honest, but it is a programme of austerity. I would say it's also a programme of liberation because it's allowing people to spend more of their own money as they wish, but I think the political market's probably not quite ready for that term yet.
Richard, do you have another word for austerity?
Yes, I do. It's not the return of austerity, it is the return of productivity. The only period that we have had of profound improvements in the productivity of the public sector was the period from 2010 to 2019. Didn't have that under Blair and Brown, didn't have it really since 2019 under the Conservatives, certainly not under the current government. The point about the word austerity is the idea that you get better public services if you spend more. Well, that's not true. You get better public services when you get better public services. And often that means have a focus on your customer. Who are you delivering the service for, rather than some form you've got to fill in for some other bureaucratic system that you have on the sidelines you've got to compete with. Having a focus on ensuring that you're delivering something at the lowest possible cost. And so I think we really do need to engage people. It's a sort of a people's effort to try and get this productivity. And as I pointed out earlier, I'm hoping there are ways with technology you can get citizen interest in the idea about their control over how the public services they consume, their families consume, their communities consume, that says we want to have more control because we think there are ways that we can get better services delivered at lower cost. So it's the return of productivity, not return of austerity.
Andrew.
The media will choose whatever language they want, public sector spending or a very large market share of the media, and that shouldn't be entirely excluded from Richard's denominations when he's looking at where to make savings. But the issue is if we are not united. So if we have a clear set of plans and we as MPs are all signed up to that and we are clear in advance, then the media will call it what they want. But the point is we will hang together. At the first time of contact with the enemy, we will not crumble, we will push on and prevail. And I still think that is, for most people, not their lived experience. Their lived experience is their neighbour on welfare while they're going out taking 2 jobs to buy the kids their uniform. Their lived experience is seeing foreign offenders in British jails being paid by the British taxpayer and on and on. So as long as we are confident in our judgments, we choose our use cases wisely, I think we should trust to the honest good sense of the British people. And if we didn't, then certainly us MPs, we're in the wrong business.
Shamil, I think you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that in some ways the term austerity has taken on something of a life of its own. I think it's important that we keep in mind why there was austerity in the first place. Austerity was put in place not because the coalition government, had sort of an ideological zeal for austerity. I'm sure if they could, they would have spent unlimited amounts of money. Politicians at the end of the day, but it was necessary because public finances was in such a dire state. And I think in the face of a financial shock, it was necessary to reduce public spending. I mean, at the very height of the crisis, the deficit was 10% of GDP. That's a massive amount. And I think we see today that that sort of problem is creeping back up on us. So I think at the peak, public spending was about 45% of GDP during the crisis. I think now it's set to be 45% permanently. So it's not coming down in terms of the government forecast. I think in some ways the term austerity is also a bit of a misnomer because if you look at some departments, some areas of government spending, like the NHS, we see that every single year under the Conservative government, under the past 14 years essentially, it has received more than inflation increases. So it's received real terms increases. And we look at the results that have come from those real terms increases, and we don't see the sort of improvements that are necessary in order to keep up with demand. So I think in some ways the term austerity has really been misused by the media.
Okay, we're coming back to this side. I think we've got a question at the back.
Hi, Madeline Ross. I'm from the Daily Telegraph. I did lots of reporting on the winter fuel payment and the row over that. How can Conservatives say repeatedly at events here and across across the conference that they want to cut spending and then push the government into a U-turn on what was a £300 payment which was given to millionaires and will still go to millionaires?
Andrew, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, just look very, very simply and openly. Just because you say, as we clearly do and will and support, that we want to reduce the size of the state, does not mean that we blanketly, blindly have to follow every single proposal that might work in that direction. If the Labour government came out with defence cuts, that would be a reduction in the size of state spending. Would we as Conservatives, without any discernment, blindly follow them into the lobbies on that? We set out a very clear set of what we thought would be sustainable reforms that would be of benefit to the taxpayer, reduce the number of people on benefit. That wasn't what that was. It failed in its own terms. It clearly was not even supported by a Labour government with a very significant majority. So just don't set the test, intellectually, that every single time on any single cut, the Conservative Party, if it's not serious, has to blindly follow Labour into the lobbies. That would be my position. We should look at each thing's on their own merits. The Labour government do the right thing, then that's fine. Right, the Prime Minister is in India, I'm the Trade Secretary, I support that. This is good, right? We need to grow our economy. And I've said I've support that, but we're not going to be unthinking in opposition in either direction.
Let's take another question. We'll go back to this side of the room. Yes, the gentleman here in the middle.
I'm Rosalind Carr from City AM. In the past, Tory chancellors have faced fiscal holes and they've raised taxes. Mel Stride has obviously said that raising income tax is the cleanest tax hike that Reeds could make. Do you agree with Mel Stride, and what tax hike would you choose?
Richard, I feel like that could be a good one for you to start on.
Well, I always agree with Mel Stride, the shadow chancellor, my boss, but I don't agree that we should increase income tax. So you can square that circle as best you wish. The answer to the long-term problems of the UK is not to tax people more. Tax rates are already too high. It was very painful as a Conservative Member of Parliament for 2019 to 24. First of all, with the terrible infringement of individual liberties that was put in place through the COVID restrictions, which caused me a profound moral burden, I must say. I did not come into politics to do that, and I have a terrible regret about it all. Notwithstanding the rights and wrongs, it was just really, really, really hard. But also then, closing down so much of the productive side of the economy, public sector, and putting all those restrictions, there had to be a state response. Well, you couldn't just tell businesses to close down, people not to go work, and then just let businesses go to the wall. That was not the right thing. So the corollary of the close down was that you had to put support into the society, rightly or wrongly, the right stays, whatever, I don't know. And then the right answer to that, as it then follows the third level, was then you have to pay it back for all the reasons I've just been talking about at the start, which is we can't keep passing it down and putting more and more boulders on the backs of our children and grandchildren and say, well, you pay for it because we can't be paid to it. So we had to raise taxes. But that one-off system was in place. We had put all that in place. There was no need for Rachel Reeves to come and pretend there was a big black hole he had to fill, when actually what she was saying is, I like socialism, so I want to tax you more, take money off you, to help me pursue the socialist ambitions that I have for our country. Here you go, doctors and railway workers and you can have loads of money and not do any productivity. That's the Labour conceit. That's what's created the problem. So it is a problem that's been created by raising taxes on the private sector, meaning that businesses won't hire, people's wages are restricted, and growth has stalled. And the answer in difficult circumstances like that is for the state to live within its means. Kemi Badenoch's been very clear. That's the purpose, and that's why Andrew's on this panel, why David and I are on this panel. It's a united team to make that happen. And my point, I know I'm talking too long, but the other thing about unity, and why Andrew was so right about that, when you and I are short of money, we look for a fiver, right? When Rachel's short of money, she looks for 5 billion, right? And she got into February of this year, and she knew she had the spring statement coming up. And she was like, oops, I've got 5 billion shortfall. Can someone help me, Liz, Kendall, in welfare reform? And forgetting all of the profoundly detailed work that Ian Duncan Smith and the Conservative think tanks had done on welfare reform, which informed the Conservative way that we did welfare reform during the coalition afterwards. She went to Liz and just said, give me 5 billion. They came up with half-baked scheme. Now that night when Rachel and I was on Newsnight with one Jeremy Corbyn. You may have heard of him. And the point I made then, I make now, and it gets to Andrew's point about the importance of unity in difficult times. As I said, when we had to go through this as constituency MPs, you met people who you were taking away benefits from or were going to have to be reviewed for their benefit. They were scared. They were worried, and mistakes would be made. And I said it was tough as an MP to do that. It was when the rubber hit the road, it was when you meet your constituents. But we believed in purpose, the purpose of that. Labour MPs didn't. And now you have seen, less than a year later, how that has completely fallen apart and we're further in the mess. So my final point on the whole issue about tax cuts and others is the importance of unity of purpose once you decide. And of course, we've all got to go in it to make sure we reach the success.
David.
Thank you. Well, obviously, I sort of made a bit of a jibe at Mel at the start in my remarks. I think to be fair to him, if we must, he was comparing, I think, the choice between lots and lots of kind of tinkering tax rises and one simple, clean tax rise. And obviously, it's a rule of politics not to answer questions you don't want to answer or don't want to be framed in that way. So I think it's a pity he said what he did. We should be looking to cut spending, not contemplating raising any tax at the moment. And the problem with this, I don't want to make too much of it because it may pass without comment, but the problem with it is, one, it'll be quoted back to us. The Shadow Chancellor says raising income tax is okay. That's the first thing. Second, we're trying to persuade people, somewhat implausibly in my view, that Nigel Farage is a tax-raising socialist. I'm not really convinced by that line of argument, I must admit, but then we must be really disciplined ourselves not to give the same impression. And third, it kind of confirms the narrative, which is so prevalent and why people aren't listening to us, that you can't really trust the Conservative Party. And, we really have to be careful about these sort of things on such sensitive issues. I don't want to labour it too much, as I say, but it is a bit unfortunate.
Okay, let's go back to this side of the room. Yes, we've got the gentleman at the front here, Anne. Just here.
Hi, Jeremy Maddox. I'm chairman of the largest Conservative branch in the country. My question is relating to the pensions liabilities. The public sector pensions liabilities, Richard said, amount to about £1.5 trillion. I read it's about £2.6 trillion, and I think the Daily Telegraph talked about a figure of £5.8 trillion. But whatever the numbers, our public sector employees are extremely expensive if you add in the pensions. And one way to reduce that would be to reduce the number of public sector employees. And I think one of the ways that we could do that would be to put some of, or many of those public sector employees into the private sector. And that would be things like the Passport Office or the DVLC or other things which could be put out to some kind of a tender competition so that we have more than one different option for buying passports or dealing with our driving licenses. And this new ICE force for 150,000 migrants being sent out of the country every year, that's going to require huge numbers of employees. Why not get the private sector involved and pay them by results and pay them according to the number of people that they actually get out of the country and make sure that they're not getting public sector pensions? Thank you.
Andrew, do you want to start on that one?
Just quickly, in the interest of time, because you make some really good points and we don't need long answers to all of those. But clearly the public sector is too large. There is a public sector pay gap in this country. And the pay gap is that in too many cases, the public sector, when you take into account those pension entitlements that very few people in this room will ever be able to dream of, they're paid more than their private sector counterparts. So you make a very good point, and that public sector pay gap, which we don't hear enough rage about, do we, from the left, is something that we might want to talk about a little bit more.
Richard.
First of all, I agree with Andrew and you on some of the suggestions. The difference in the numbers, 1.4, 2.6, is the discount rate that was used was changed in 2024, which brought it down from 2.6 to 1.4. Make of that what you will. I think on pensions, there's a deeper issue which is funding, which is there's a sort of pensions apartheid between pensions in the public sector, which are defined benefit, and largely now, if you go into the private sector, you're on defined contribution. There is a different risk around defined contribution pensions than there is around defined benefit. And somehow that, I think, is unhealthy long term. We have one set working on one set another. It also, because departments aren't charged the full cost of the pension liability that they have incurred with their existing employees, they are given a charge for the pensions cost of the year, but not the full liability. You open yourself up to thinking that labour is cheaper than it actually is if you run a particular department. For those reasons, I think it is interesting to look at those points and the other issues that you mentioned about different ways of doing things in competition. I fully concur as good ideas.
Shimin, did you want to jump in quickly?
Yeah, just very quickly, I want to say that's a fantastic question. I think you're saying precisely what the politicians should be saying. We're identifying areas where we want to reduce the scope of government, talking about specific areas, things like passports, even things like prisons, whether the private sector can play a greater role in that. And that, I think, is far more helpful than just talking about headline figures or like we want to reduce the number of civil servants. We have to talk about specifics. What exactly do we want to reduce in terms of the scope of government?
Let's come back over to this side. Callum, there's a lady in the second row here. It should be on.
I'm not quite sure if this is relevant, but I'm a councillor at Thanet District Council. We have quite a lot of unpaid rent from the council tenants. I ask a question. What's the threshold when you start to act on this? And I was told it's £10,000 in arrears. And I think one of the things that could improve things, once upon a time, the rent was taken out of their benefit, and that would, it sounds cruel, but that in the end would actually save quite a lot of money.
Who wants to take that one on? Andrew, any views on that one?
I mean, only that sounds eminently sensible. I mean, if the state, remember, no one is forced to take taxpayer money. So that is a privilege. So once you cross that Rubicon, it's different from other domains in which we are entitled to insist on defending our personal privacy and liberty. And if the state is paying for people's lifestyles, then it is entitled to expect certain things in return. So whether that's direct payment because you're purchasing services that are being provided on people's behalf. The point that was made somewhere earlier about, you don't have an entitlement automatically to choose exactly where in the country you live. We have council-funded properties, state-funded, taxpayer-funded properties within half a mile of Mayfair, the most expensive square on the Monopoly board. Why would that be a case when, there are people who are commuting long distances to work in our offices? If anyone's ever done a speed awareness course, I hold up my hand, full disclosure, you have to log on, right? You have to log on. Right, you can't be on your phone. You have to have the screen cleared. They have to be very clear where you are. Why do we not, for as example, this is not policy, this is an example. Why do we not, for those people who are being paid to apparently be job seeking, why do they not log on at 8:55 in the morning and log off at 5 o'clock at night? And they're doing useful Oak Academy style remote delivered courses in what different jobs are available, or work-ready skills, or upskilling literacy or numeracy if those are impedances in the market. Last time I looked, there's an awful lot of verges in our wonderful country. There are some in Sussex. There's no doubt some in Bedfordshire, which are got far too much litter for people who have pride in our country. And if there are people who are in receipt of state benefits, why wouldn't that, excluding those that are disabled and have a physical disability, why wouldn't that be a useful, purposeful activity that would show people the discipline of getting up and being ready for a particular activity at a particular time? So there's a longer answer than you wanted. I wanted to move that slightly into the more moral domain, which is we are speaking here at the TaxPayers Alliance, and it is quite right that the taxpayer, all of you, get a fair bargain when they are procuring to support other people's lifestyles.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left, so we'll take two quick-fire questions. Yes, and the gentleman right in front of you in the pink shirt.
The Jeremy Corbyns of the world would say all of this is irrelevant because we can just tax the super wealthy. How do we, and that's very compelling to a lot of people in my generation, how do we make the argument that would in fact be disastrous?
And on this side, can we just see hands? Yes, the gentleman here, Callum, right side next to you.
Should kids with ADHD get brand new cars?
Okay, wealth tax. Richard, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, so the answer to your question is that the super wealthy have a phalanx of accountants that either enable them to not pay the level of tax that everybody else pays, or advise them to go to other jurisdictions where they can retain their wealth. That option is not available. So when the left say we should tax the super wealthy, what they mean is people on medium-sized incomes. That's what and that is essentially what has occurred in politics for at least the last 5 years, and that's what's going to occur again with the thresholds being frozen and potentially Rachel Reeves saying she's going to freeze them again. So when the left say super wealthy, just think that means you and your family. Should kids with ADHD get a car? I didn't know that they Oh, you've stayed. Good. I didn't know that they. I thought you were going to get your car. All right. So the answer is I don't think so.
David, do you want to take on either wealth taxes or ADHD kids getting cars?
I don't have much to add, to be honest. I just think we should treat the wealth tax idea with the derision it deserves. Wherever it's been tried, it doesn't raise the amount of money. It's often been reversed out when European countries have tried it, and we must just sort of pour scorn on it as a kind of pretend fix. And that's the argument that has to be made, I think.
Shimon.
I think it's a bit laughable, the idea that we haven't raised enough taxes. I mean, taxes are already at a record high. I mean, we have increased taxes massively in this country. The problem is that spending has risen even quicker. That's the problem, spending. Now, I should just note that it's not just us saying this. Even think tanks like the Institute for Fiscal Studies have said that every other European country that has higher public spending funds that from higher taxes on average earners, not the super rich. So that's every other European country. So I don't see why we're somehow very different.
And for the final word, Andrew.
Motability, no. I mean, you've got to, if you're going to run a system, it relies upon a societal compact that both sides feel fair. And the example of Motability, clearly that is not the case. It's a very large amount of money, and anyone looking for low-hanging fruit, because there's going to be a lot tougher decisions than that my colleagues need to sign up to, should absolutely have Motability firmly in their sights. Thank you as well for all the work that TaxPayers Alliance do on this and so many other areas that identify these areas, root out and ferret the truths that the public sector want to conceal from us. It is an enormous moral stain on the approach of this government that they are passive at best at the fact that tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of people are leaving our country. The category error made by all politicians is that people in this day and age have more choices than ever before, and we compete with more nations than ever before. And any policy that we produce, particularly as it relates to tax, has to be looked through the lens set of that international competition. But much more so than the wealthy people who are leaving for Milan and Abu Dhabi and so many other places. The real tragedy is the young people who are leaving in their wake. They don't think that this country has a vision. They don't see opportunity. They don't see the ambition. They don't feel that their streets are safe, that they can do those wonderful things that Richard said about entering the property market, finding love, finding a family, looking forward to the next generation. That is something that we should all march to the bell of that outrage. And the first thing the Conservative government needs to do is to restore that vision and that belief so that we don't see, as we are seeing now, a brain drain of some of our best and brightest leaving this wonderful, wonderful country that can be great again.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Unfortunately, that's all the time we've got now. Hopefully, I think we're all agreed on this panel that spending does need to come down, but I think we're all very much aware that Rachel Reeves, at her budget, is going to increase taxes and spend even more. But in the meantime, before then, this afternoon in the tent, we have Mel Stride doing an In Conversation with Duncan Barks, who runs our podcast, and our Chief Executive, John O'Connell. So I do encourage you to come back at around about 5:30 for that. But thank you very much for attending, and could you thank our panel in the usual way? Thank you very much.